Cannabis is one of humanity's oldest cultivated crops. But have you ever wondered where it came from? No one knows exactly where the plant was discovered, but recent research from a fossil pollen study shows evidence of cannabis grains diverging from cumulus, or hops, about 28 million years ago on the eastern Tibetan plateau. Given this information, it's assumed cannabis was indigenous to many regions of the Eurasian continent, coexisting with humans as long as 12,000 years ago. From there, early nomads likely traveled east and west with cannabis, which allowed its discovery to spread across different regions. Once discovered, the people of this time found uses for every part of the plant, from the stems and stalks that provided fiber for food, clothing, ropes, and cords, to the roots, leaves, and flowers used for medicine and spiritual rituals. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence was depicted in cave paintings of cannabis plants and dried cannabis seeds in Japan, dating back to 10,000 BC. Many years later, cannabis plants started to be used more often for daily needs, like medicine, paper, and clothing. Around 2000 BC, the Chinese Emperor Shen Nong wrote the world's earliest literature on pharmacopoeia, known as Pen Shaoqing, where he famously cited the benefits of cannabis, or ma, for medicinal conditions ranging from menstruation to absent-mindedness, and to include over 100 other ailments. Cannabis was also used in the first anesthetic in China by Hua Tuo, father of Chinese surgery. He created a concoction of boiling wine with cannabis to sedate and numb his patients prior to the operation. Persia, India, and Assyria also used cannabis plants widely for various purposes, such as topical, oral, and rectal applications, as eye treatments, to help with feelings of grief and pain, to treat epilepsy, infections, and gout. Besides medicinal purposes, cannabis has also been used for ethnogenic and spiritual purposes by many cultures. During religious ceremonies, Buddhist practitioners often consume cannabis to facilitate meditation or heighten awareness. As part of Taoist ceremonies, incense burners with cannabis were often used to communicate with spirits, separate negative desires, and achieve inner peace. In Hinduism, cannabis was considered one of the 5 sacred plants listed in the Vedas and was often consumed during ceremonies in 3 different forms: as a drink known as bhang, as hashish, or as the flower ganja. During Scythian funeral ceremonies, the Greek historian Herodotus described burning cannabis seeds and inhaling the vapors for ritualistic and euphoric purposes. Throughout history, cannabis was regularly used as a medicine, tonic, and intoxicant across North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. But later on, as science and research evolved, Britain began to set the stage for the attitudes and policies toward hemp. In colonial Europe, hemp was such an important crop that in 1533, King Henry VIII commanded all English farmers to grow hemp or risk paying a hefty fine. In the early 1600s, cannabis seeds were commonly transported from Europe to the Americas and Canada by early settlers for the production of sails and rope. Hemp became so important in American history that when the colonies were being established, the property owners were actually required by King James I to grow 100 plants of hemp for export by way of royal decree. Over the next few decades, cannabis plantations sprouted across the US. In 1753, cannabis was first classified as a species, Cannabis sativa, by Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy. Then, in 1785, another biologist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, claimed to have discovered a new subspecies after he was given cannabis specimens collected in India. He felt that these plants should be distinguished from Cannabis sativa and classified them as Cannabis indica, based on characteristics like their firm stems, thin bark, and the shape of their leaves and flowers. In 1842, cannabis was reintroduced into British medicine by William B. O'Shaughnessy, an Irish doctor studying in India who found that cannabis extracts could help lessen stomach pain and vomiting in people suffering from cholera. Around this time, thousands of liquid cannabis extracts and resins were produced and sold in pharmacies throughout the US, Europe, and Canada. But there weren't really any stipulations around who could or couldn't sell prescriptions, since the pharmacy industry wasn't even established yet. So you had everyone from the local barber to the local wine merchant selling medicines like opium or cannabis on the side. In 1868, Great Britain passed the Pharmacy Act to help regulate the industry and promote safer use of medicines. This act allowed the Pharmaceutical Society to create a register of pharmacists qualified to sell, dispense, and compound poisons, which was how these types of products were usually referred. This was the country's first piece of legislation restricting poisons and marked a major milestone in the history of pharmacy and the pharmaceutical society. By the early 1900s, hemp production and medical interest in cannabis began to decline in the West. That decline was driven in part by researchers struggling to isolate the active ingredients in the plant, the variability in patient response times, and the discoveries of new, more consistent synthetic drugs, all led to the abandonment of many ancient herbal remedies, including cannabis. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was the first federal law passed in the United States to mention cannabis indica, including it with alcohol, opiates, cocaine, and chloral hydrate on a list of intoxicating ingredients whose presence was required to be noted on the label. As the states and federal government began to tighten restriction on the cultivation, manufacture, and sale of cannabis products, alcohol prohibition would ultimately serve as the inspiration for the criminalization of using cannabis. Instead of targeting a substance consumed by a significant portion of the white majority, law enforcement and corporate interests turned to cannabis, called it marijuana, and inflicted generational suffering that continues to this day. Which leads us into our next discussion about the history of criminalization in the United States.